Resource person for the day, Dr. Ramesh, Principal Dr. Sridhara Shetty, Vice Principal Dr. Liji Santosh, and Professor Sandesha Shetty, colleagues and dear participants. Good morning and welcome to the second day of the 10th virtual workshop on research methodology in social sciences, organized by the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of Bansanga's S.M. Shetty College of Science, Commerce and Management Studies, in association with Indian Council of Social Science Research. On the first day of the workshop, Dr. P.K. Sudarshan, Dean Research, Goa Business School, introduced us to the basics of research. He also talked about the various aspects of review of literature and the importance and ways to identify research gap. Our keynote speaker yesterday, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Mangalore University, Dr. Subramanya, mentioned that systematic approach to research and the importance of research design and methodology. Picking up the threads of research from where we ended yesterday, today's session will cover three aspects, that is, of research design, selection and identification of research problem, which will be taken by Dr. S. Ramesh, and the post-lunch session on developing hypothesis. I take this opportunity to introduce the resource person for today, Dr. S. Ramesh. Dr. Ramesh is currently working as Professor and Dean, International Programs and Partnership, PG Center, Mount Carmel College, Bengaluru. Sir is currently the Executive Secretary of Federation of Teachers Council of Commerce and Management in Karnataka. He has successfully guided 24 PhDs and 51 MPhil scholars. He has more than 45 research papers to his credit. Dr. Ramesh has carried out 3 postdoctoral major research projects funded by the UGC and International Labour Organization. Dr. Ramesh has been a resource person at more than 200 seminars and conferences. He has authored 15 books in the area of management and accounting and has organized various national and international conferences. Sir was invited to the US Embassy to conduct a study of the community colleges. He was also a member of the Indian delegation of Australia for skill-based education and was a visiting professor at SBS Swiss Business School, Zurich, Switzerland. He was the treasurer, Peace Quest International, a project funded by Swedish International Development Authority. He has worked for a collaboration between George Washington University and MSRIM and also worked for India's Study Abroad program between University of Stony Brook, New York, USA and NIMIS. Sir was a member of the expert committee of Karnataka Public Service Commission and was a part of the 5-member high power committee constituted by the government of Karnataka for restructuring commerce and management education. Sir has been a member of the Entrepreneurs Committee and Tourism Committee of the Federation of Karnataka Chambers of Commerce and Industry. He is a member of the National Council of Indian Society for Training and Development. Sir was a member of the Peer Committee of National Assessment and Accreditation Council, that is NAC Peer Team, and a member of Educational Advisory Committee of Associated Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Dr. Ramesh is a member of the National Executive Committee of Indian Commerce Association and the chairman of their National Talent Search Examination. He is a consultant to few companies and reputed colleges for quality improvement. He was a member of PG BOS in Commerce and Management, Bangalore University, member of BOS and BOE in MBA, Mysore University and Tumkur University. He was a faculty member of Mangalore University, Kuvempu University, and was a member of BOE in PhD, Pune University, Anna University, Dravidian University, and Marathwada University. Sir was a member of the Academic Council of MS Ramaiah University and CMR University and Advisory Board of Reva Group. He is a member of the Skill Development Committee in Commerce of Mangalore University. We are truly honored to have you with us today, sir, and to be able to get an opportunity to learn from you. I take this opportunity to invite you to take over the session.
Thank you, Dr. Kalpana, for a very generous introduction, and my esteemed friend, philosopher and guide, Dr. Sridhara Shetty, who is the principal of the college, and Liji Madam, who is the vice principal, and Kalpana Madam, who introduced me just now, and other colleagues and friends of mine at Mumbai, and a lot of other participants who are very keen to be a part of this workshop. I must really congratulate you for really taking some time off to be with us for this at least workshop, which is a very, very kind of very much needed workshop, I would like to say, because research is a must. So I thought maybe I'll start with a little introduction to research, and then at least describe a little about the process of research, and then in maybe the second part, maybe move on to the problem, at least how to identify a research problem and how to kind of arrive at some kind of a research design for the stated problem. So one second, I will mount. Is the screen visible now?
No, sir.
It's not visible?
No, you have to do the screen share thing.
One second. It's
Yes.
visible now? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So put it in the slide share mode.
Is it audible now?
Yes, sir. It's audible and visible both.
Yeah.
If you can just put it in the slide share mode.
Live share mode, is it?
Yes, sir. There above the cursor, next to animations on the top screen, if you can see.
No, I don't see that.
Slide show.
I don't see that option.
So there is that on the top menu button, there is home. Can you spot the home button?
1 second.
Sir, if possible, press F5 button.
F5. F5, no?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I tried, it's not moving. Control F5 or only F5?
Only F5.
Not moving.
Else, sir, below there is a small cup icon you can see.
Bottom right hand side
Bottom.
corner. Yeah, yeah.
Just click that. Yes.
Yeah.
That.
That I will
Okay.
not- yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, you're asking for the enlargement. I thought, no, live stream means I don't have to go to live YouTube, maybe something to do with that, I thought. It's okay. So thank you for a very generous introduction. I thought I'll begin with a little introduction to research and then move on to the process of research and others. So as we know that the whole, at least human progress and development is as a result of research. Research is a very, very important part and parcel of any economy, any individual, and any system for that matter. Because if you look at right from the history, any problem, any answers to any pertinent questions, any at least clarifications to any doubt raised by any system or a country or an individual or a company or any at least system or a structure for that matter is answered only through research. So research has been the basis for the human at least evolution and also development. So let us first understand what exactly is the research. And research, what research actually does is it seeks answers to the questions and it finds solutions to a given problem. And then, please mind you, basically a research is not simply a trial and error activity, it's more intellectual activity. And what does this intellectual activity does is, it gathers information. First, it tries to kind of define what the problem is. A research basically defines what the issue or what the problem is or what the question is. And based on the data, it gathers all the information, all the evidence, and all the data required in order to answer those issues or the problem. And finally, it arrives at some kind of a conclusion or solution to the problem. So what are the basic, at least characteristics to say that there is some research, there is some scientific activity, any research must fulfill certain conditions. First, it is a systematic process. It is because there is a methodology involved in research. it's a step-by-step approach, because if you skip one step and go to the next step, you will not be able to kind of arrive. For instance, that you cannot collect the data and then think about the problem, or you cannot arrive at some conclusion and then arrive at certain findings, and so on. So basically, it's a very systematic process of finding out at least solutions to a given problem. It is also, it's a critical investigation, in the sense any research for that matter necessarily needs some kind of an investigation. Even if you know, even if you're very sure, let's say a group of people are very sure about a certain phenomenon, even if they kind of take some kind of conclusion, it becomes very subjective. If any research has to be objective, a critical investigation, re-investigation of the facts and relating one with another, only then actually it becomes research. So therefore, it is a critical investigation. And please mind you, the duty of any researcher is not only to adore and advocate. The duty of any researcher is also to criticize and condemn. Criticize and condemn, not only adore and advocate, but also criticize and condemn, and bring out the truth of the research findings. And please mind you, mere compilation is not going to be a work of research. In the sense, if you merely pick up so much of at least literature from the books and reproduce it, that means these days what's happening is copy paste, of course, is the research technology everywhere. As somebody said, if you at least copy from several at least articles and books, it becomes research. Whereas if you copy from only one, it becomes plagiarism. So what I'm trying to say is, in research, what is most important is it's the aggregation. That means not merely a compilation, taking from all the books and compiling it together and putting it in some report form does not become research. So basically, mere compilation, it does not become a work of research. There should be some problem, there should be an investigation, there should be a data, and there should be ultimately final conclusion. And please mind you, it's a purposive investigation. That means any investigation for that matter is conducted with a certain purpose. That means any research you start with the end in mind. That means you must keep the end in mind as to what results that you desire, what is the outcome of the research, and only plan a research. And it also interpreting and explaining a phenomenon. A research, one of the characteristics of research is it describes the phenomenon as to why a phenomenon occurs. That means when somebody looks at an object in the sky, that you try to kind of explain the phenomenon as to why that object exists in the sky. Is it a planet? Is it a kind of a star? Is it some object? So it explains some kind of a phenomenon. And it adopts of course scientific method. Well, that we must understand what do you mean by a scientific method when we say it's a scientific method. Because science is a systematized body of knowledge which is based upon observation, then hypothesis, investigation, and inference. Any scientific study for that matter involves basically these four are the four pillars of scientific method. That means one is observation, second is hypothesis, the third one is the investigation, fourth one is the conclusion. So any research for that matter, it must first observe. It observes. Like say, let us say you want to study maybe the behavior of the students, maybe that in an afternoon class as compared to a morning class. What first you do is you try to observe them. You try to observe them. How do they behave in the morning? How do they behave in the afternoon? How do they behave? It's a kind of an early morning class or evening class and so on. First you observe. Then you try to kind of do some kind of hypothesis. Hypothesis is a statement, the validity of which needs to be tested. It's a tentative statement, the validity of which needs to be tested. So you try to form some kind of an hypothesis as to why they take so much of interest in the morning. And why do they kind of, do not take so much of interest in the afternoon class? Is it because they go off to sleep? Or is it because they get tired? Or is it because actually that they're very eager to go and play? So there could be any kind of guesswork that you do is a hypothesis. The validity of which needs to be tested, because A hypothesis gives you some kind of a direction for research. And please mind you, it is objective and very logical. Any research for that matter must be very logical. That means there must be some kind of an evidence and logic behind whatever you do. And it is the ability of the researcher to find that kind of a logic. So unless a researcher is competent to be very logical, very kind of, that there is what is called a systemic thinking is what is really required in research. And it applies all the possible tests to validate the data. Please mind you that one of the true tests of research is the validation. Whatever you speak in research, there must be supported by a valid evidence. Because they say there must be objectivity in research. If you say, if you ask me what is objectivity, somebody gave a very fine definition of objectivity in research. It says, ability and willingness to examine evidence dispassionately. I repeat again, objectivity in research means ability and willingness to examine evidence dispassionately. That means without any subjectivity, you're going to kind of arrive at some kind of a findings. So it's your ability and willingness to examine the evidence. That is, you're trying to look at the evidence and then conclude, not by your own personal preferences, whims and fancies. So it's based upon observable experience. Please mind you that research must always be based on an observable experience. That means when you explain a phenomenon, you should be able to observe that kind of phenomenon. That means there must be evidence of that observation. If you say, no, that I found out that it is this kind of a phenomenon, this kind of an explanation. But if somebody asks you, please show me, how do I observe that? If you say, no, only I am able to see, it does not again become research. It should be generally observable experience and answers pertinent questions. So please mind you, any research is a very focused activity. That means you're not going to take up anything and everything. You take small little. As the research by definition, it says, knowing more and more about very less and less is research. Knowing more and more about very less and less is research. That means you should take a very minute aspect in any kind of a body of knowledge, work on that and master that, and you should be able to kind of say with authority, this is what the findings of the research is. You take a very big project and simply go on the surface, it does not become research. That's what it meant. And it provides solutions to the problem. And please mind you, it's a very exhaustive investigation. Well, having known the characteristics of research, we then move on to what is the purpose of research. Please mind you, the very purpose of any research for that matter is to familiarity with the phenomenon. That means if a phenomenon is occurring in your day-to-day life or in a country's day-to-day life, it is repeating. And so you want to become very familiar as to why such a phenomenon occurs. For instance, that we are caught with COVID. Maybe that, the epidemic you saw that, it was really kind of, created such a kind of havoc. But we were really surprised. Nobody had any kind of a research on this virus, nor did we have any kind of a vaccine for this. And we had to get familiar with this phenomenon. So many researches were conducted. So many medicines really came out. So many, at least, maybe scientific, at least, investigations were conducted. And now we are very, very familiar with this kind of virus to a certain extent, if not fully. So familiarity with the phenomenon is what really is research, is the purpose of research. And it should show new insights into the issue. The purpose of research is not only to explain what it is, it also should explain that what are the new facets. For instance, taking the COVID itself as the issue. There are new, at least, versions of this COVID, at least, is coming up. So your investigation should also not only explain what is COVID, but also kind of other types of viruses. Why such mutations happen? All this must be very clearly explained by your research, and only then that the future possibilities are also identified in research. And it must describe accurately as much as possible. Because if you say that only there's a 20% possibility, 60% possibility, it does not really become research. It must be accurately weigh what is really required. Like say, if you want to do some research on maybe the status of poverty among Indian rural people, you must be able to get exact, at least a picture of why the poverty exists, what is the level of poverty and all this, and not merely get some kind of an idea at a very superficial level. And determine the frequency. It also must say how frequently this phenomenon is occurring, how frequently a particular phenomenon is occurring. That must also be kind of stated. Not only say it is occurring, but it should also say how often it occurs. And it's a problem. The whole purpose is to solve the problem and also pinpoint what are the other related issues. And you should be able to test a hypothesis in a research. That means you must be able to use some kind of tools in order to kind of test your hypothesis, either nullify it or accept it. And it finds current trends. The purpose of research also to explain what are the possible trends coming up, at least in the near future, so that you can make some kind of decision. That means you should be able to extrapolate and interpolate the facts that are going to kind of come through, at least in the future, so that you can, using your foresight, you can have some kind of strategy to accept or say offset such uncertainties. And it also finds change in the pattern. Well, having at least discussed about what are the characteristics of the research and what is the purpose, let us move on. What are the types of research that one can talk about? There are different types of research. One is what is called a descriptive research, whereby it only describes the attributes. It describes the attributes. It may not quantify. It only describes, qualitative description of all the possible things that may happen as a result of a particular phenomenon is what descriptive research is all about. In an exploratory research, you're trying to explore an unexplored area. You're trying to explore. Maybe somebody has not gone there at all. You're not even seen that kind of a place or that kind of a phenomenon. You're trying to explore a new, at least maybe that problem area or an issue. So it is the first time. It's an untrodden, at least path, and you're only the kind of first person to go and find out what it is all about. For instance, that when kind of the Tenzing went up at the Himalayas, he found it. At least this is the thing. So the first time that maybe or whatever, he was one of the first maybe to go there and find out what it was. Yeah. Then predictive. In the case of predictive research, it predicts actually. That is, it predicts as to what is going to be the weather. What is going to be weather at least tomorrow? What's going to be weather in the next month? What's going to be weather in a particular month? It predicts. Or it's going to predict what's going to be the sales in the month of January, sales in the month of February. Or it also predicts what's going to be the GDP of the country in the near to come. Or it predicts what's going to be the outcome of practicing a particular kind of a culture over a period of time. So predictive research is, it predicts what's going to be the possibilities in the future to come. Then, for instance, the allied again, applied research. The next method is the applied research. Here, what is important is how do we kind of apply certain kind of theories that are already, or models that have already been developed, and apply it to a certain situation and see what's going to be the outcome of such research. So applied research is a theoretical or modular concepts are applied in order to derive certain results. In a comparative research, you're comparing two periods of time. Maybe that you're making a comparison between pre-Mughal and post-Mughal era, or pre-COVID era, post-COVID era. You're drawing certain kind of comparisons with certain thing in mind. Maybe either regarding a development or regarding education, or what was the knowledge level of these students before COVID, or post-COVID. Comparative studies that you can conduct becomes comparative research. Then there's also what is called as fundamental research. Another type of research is a fundamental research. In the case of fundamental research, you're trying to evolve a theory itself. You're trying to formulate a model or a theory, you're constructing some theory. See, there are already so many theories which are already conducted either in management or in economics, or you talk about maybe a Giffen's paradox is some kind of a concept somebody has evolved. So that is the most very kind of a fundamental research somebody has done, and they have arrived at some kind of a conclusion. So that becomes very fundamental research. And a quantitative research, the research can be both quantitative. In the case of a quantitative research, please mind you, it uses a lot of at least numerical analysis based on the data, and it arrives at some kind of it can be quantified. Whatever can be quantified, because all research cannot be quantified. There is some research which cannot be quantified, can only be qualified. So such a quantification exists when there is a numerical analysis of all the kind of related facts and figures. So you quantify the data. In the case of qualitative research, there are certain issues. Let us say you want to analyze the performance of a public relations officer in a company. It's only qualitative judgment. You can't say he has met 100 people, customers, and solved their problem and things like that. Or he has met some 100 media people and he has enhanced the image of the company. It's more qualitative. So that's qualitative research again. Then conceptual research is you're trying to evolve a concept. For instance, let us say that there is maybe that concept called as globalization, that which is when you try to kind of be at least think global and act local. That's a concept of globalization. That means you're taking also the global issues and also applying to the local situation. So that's the new conceptual, at least framework that you really developed. So it becomes a very conceptual research. So having understood what is the research, at least characteristics, what are the types of research, and what is the purpose of research, we move on to what is the research process. That how you have to do, even if you're a first timer in research, even if you're a kind of beginner of research, please you have to very carefully understand this research process. As we have already understood through the meaning of research that it answers unanswered questions, it answers or maybe finds solutions to the unanswered problems. So a research process basically begins with selection and identification of a research problem. As I've been very repeatedly telling, there is no problem, no research, because you cannot reinvent the wheel. The wheel is already there. Somebody has already invented the wheel. If you're going to say, I'm going to reinvent the wheel, it's not research. You are going to kind of talk about what others have already kind of done. So basically, that if there is no problem, there is no research at all. So you should be able to identify some problem and only then work on that, it becomes research. So therefore, the very first step is the selection and identification of the research problem. So to do research, please mind you, you should have a problem on hand. How are you going to have, so what do you mean by a problem again? A problem is not necessarily a typical problem. It is an area of concern which is unanswered so far, or area of a problem which is not solved so far. It can be any area. It can be in your own home front. It can be your own business. It can be to your own institution. It can be your own country. It can be your own economy. It can be your own kind of, maybe practices. It can be your own religion. It can be your own kind of, maybe that the practices that you kind of evolved. It is your own behavior. It can be your own income. It can be anything. So first you must identify. As a beginner of research, please mind you, how to identify a problem is until and unless you are a very good reader, unless you are a very ferocious reader, that you will not be able to identify any problem at all. So if you look around in your own subject area, if you are looking at, let us say maybe that business or management is your subject. Well, if you've been reading a lot of newspapers, journals, books, and so on, somewhere you come across some kind of a problem for which you have not found some kind of solution. Maybe, for instance, if you're a business, at least, from the background, during the, at least, COVID itself, that there are a lot of supply. Supply was not kind of curtailed. There was supply. Prices, one side, prices also did not even increase. In fact, a lot of discounts and so many things were offered. People were not really buying. The whole problem during that, any recession, it's a situation of a recession. At that point of time, people have a lot of money. It's not that people did not have money. People have the money, but they're not willing to spend. This is more to do with behavioral economics. People have the money, goods are available, but nobody is willing to buy because there's some kind of a chaos in the market. The very mental equilibrium of the consumer is very disturbed. So he is unable to act and take any kind of wide decision and move towards purchase. So that's a very tricky situation, a very sound ground for doing some kind of research as to during such pandemic, how do these consumers react? What is their purchasing behavior? What is their attitude towards the market? What is their attitude towards the pricing policy? What is their attitude towards the supply? What is their attitude towards the promotional policies and so on? Or for instance, that now you're an economist, that there are so many areas of economics that maybe it can be developmental economics, you're talking about poverty economics or international economics, whatever, you can kind of maybe that. And in that itself, you can at least arrive at some kind of problem. Maybe that, when you're talking about kind of economics itself, that you're looking at maybe that did the poverty level of people increase or decrease during the pandemic, for that matter. Or maybe that you're a psychologist, you're trying to make a comparison between intelligence level and behavior of students during the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Or you're a sociology kind of researcher, maybe you're trying to understand the impact of culture, traditions, and so on, maybe during at least this COVID itself. I'm just giving an example of COVID, but there can be many more things that you can kind of really work on. And so first you must have a research problem in hand. And this problem, please mind you, can be identified only if you are being a very good reader. You've been reading some newspapers, journals, you're discussing in some seminars, conferences, and so on. And please mind you, identify a problem which is very dearer in a subject that is very dearer to you. It becomes very easy for you to conduct research. How do you do this identification and research of problem? That anyway, in the second part, we are going to deal with how to select a problem. I'll come to that later. The second step in research is a review of related literature. Well, that if you want to kind of work in some area such as say poverty area itself, so you have to kind of go through the literature. What is the current state of research on poverty, at least so far? So once you have at least gone through the literature, several articles, several books, several reports, and so on, you'll be able to identify some problem area with regard to, let's say, poverty itself, issue itself. So then, once you review the literature, then you will arrive at certain issues which are still not answered, and then you bring it to the form statement of a problem. So having done some research, we'll go into the details of this problem statement and all that later. The next step is to state the exact problem. Prepare a statement of the problem, that India is a country which has several plans and developmental at least schemes In spite of that, we have lived, there are many people who have lived below the poverty line and whatever, and still this, there are needs for some kind of research to answer certain unanswered questions. So, or maybe that, during maybe that, when this government took over, that, maybe you're trying to understand the impact of maybe the currency issue itself. So the currency, regarding the currency, the purpose of the currency issue was to ensure that the black money at least is unearthed, and also they wanted to bring back that the Swiss money and whatever. At least there were several issues which were kind of raised, and whether you can do a research on what was the impact of such at least currency policy. So the next one is that so you try to kind of understand a problem and try to work on that particular problem. So the statement of the problem. So demonetization, what I was talking about, what is its impact ultimately on different sectors of the economy? Maybe you talk about maybe the financial state of the country, the GDP of the country, talk about on the industrial development of the country, or the purchasing power of people, whatever. You try to identify a problem and try to work on it. Then once you have identified some kind of a problem area, the next thing is you must develop certain objectives for your research. So try to develop what objectives are you going to achieve in order to kind of do research on a particular problem that you already stated. Then statement of hypothesis, you develop certain hypothesis. And hypothesis is a tentative assumption, the validity of which needs to be tested. You say that as a result of demonetization, that maybe that one of the maybe that your hypothesis that if maybe that the lesser the quantum of cash withdrawals allowed by the banks, more is the kind of more is there's an increase in the technology banking habits of the people. So whether so as a result of reduced at least cash levels and cash withdrawals, whether the e-banking at least practices have increased among at least certain set of population. So you have to at least arrive at some kind of hypothesis. The validity of niche needs to be tested later on. Then development of tools for data collection. So once you have identified the problem, you have set the objective. The next thing is that you'll have to develop, because you have to answer certain questions in research for which you need the data. If there is a problem, there is an objective. In order to achieve the objective, you need some kind of a data. So you develop certain tools, a questionnaire or interview schedule and so on, collect the data. You have to use some kind of sampling. I'll come to this in detail later. And later you will have to collect the data. Once you collect the data, you have to analyze the data. So once you analyze the data, so then you have to test the hypothesis. So having collected the data, you're going to at least testify at least test the hypothesis through some maybe chi-square or regression or correlation or whatever, some statistical tools that you use, and try to know whether your hypothesis is right or it is not right, nullify it. Then you have to prepare certain, tabulate the data and have some generalization and interpret the data using some tables and explanation and so on. And ultimately, you have to write the research report. The whole process of research is problem, then problem, after identify the problem, see the literature, then find out the research gap, then form certain objectives. After you form certain objectives, then you have to develop a hypothesis, and then you have to collect the data through some sampling, and then analyze the data, then test the hypothesis, then arrive at certain kind of findings, conclusions, and recommendations. That's how a research report is prepared. Then, so what are the research process? Then we look at elements of a research design. So at least having, in order to do any kind of research, please mind you, you must have a plan. How do you go about planning your research is, there are so many elements that you need to have in a research plan. A research design is a blueprint of your research as to what is the problem, how you're going to collect the data, what method are you going to use in order to collect the data, what tools you will use in order to at least analyze the data, and what are the definition of your concepts, what is the geographical area that's covered, what is the scope of your study, what is the reference period, and how are you going to kind of provide the reference period, how are you going to analyze the data, how do you want to classify your research report into chapters, what is the financial budget for research, all these are to be planned. So this is a research design is a blueprint of the research. So how do you at least so these are the elements of research design. First thing is going back again, in a research design, you have to make plan, you have to prepare a plan for your research. These are all the components that you have to write before you start your research. Little introduction to whatever at least subject. That for instance, that you are taken up some study. Let us say on this, we were referring to this, poverty issue itself. Little introduction to poverty and what are the causes of poverty and what is the status of poverty in the country and all of this introduction that you'll incorporate as a part of your research design. Then you will state the problem as to what is the exact problem. If it is just say poverty, then not enough. Are you really looking at any segment for the purpose of studying this poverty? Are you trying to study the poverty in a rural area? Even among the rural area, you're talking about over the female population or the male population? Are you talking about a certain maybe community? Are you talking about a certain people with certain occupation among only the farmers or among certain businessmen in the rural area? You have to kind of look at what should be the kind of problem in question. So you have to state the problem very clearly. I'll give you the examples of statement problem as we proceed again. And of course, so you have to review the literature. Then you define the scope of the study. When you talk about the scope of study, you should define what is the geographical scope of the study and also the function scope of study. Under the scope of study, you should say whether your study is limited to only the Bangalore rural district, a study of poverty in the Bangalore rural district, or you're going to kind of study that is in different, at least rural areas of Karnataka, or are you going to study in all the rural areas of South India or the whole of India, or you're looking at the global poverty of different countries, making comparisons, whatever. So you must state the geographical limit of your study and also the functional limit. That means, whether you're going to cover only the rural poverty or the urban poverty, and again that, in the poverty itself, the different, at least, functional areas that you're going to cover must be clearly stated, both the functional, at least, issues and also geographical. Here, you have to identify where, for the purpose of scope, you have to identify the variables related to poverty. See, there are different variables that are related to poverty. Maybe that, the occupation and the gender matters, the kind of religion matters, the kind of location really matters, number of children in the family matters. All these are variables of the study. So in the scope, you must state what are the variables that you're going to cover. Are you going to cover the income level of individuals, their family status, their employment status, or whatever you're going to cover must be stated in the scope study, both geographical limit of the study and the functional variables of study, both must be stated in the scope of the study. Then having stated the scope, then the objectives must be very, very clear. You must state what are the objectives of your study. What are the objectives of your study must be very clearly stated. For any study, objectives are the end points that you would like to kind of achieve, and what will be the desired goal of your study must be very clearly stated. For instance, in a poverty study itself, the objectives could be, first thing is to study the kind of economic status of these rural individuals in Bangalore rural area, rural Bangalore for that matter. To study the occupation of different, at least rural people in this particular area. Maybe third objective is to study comparative study of, make a comparison between poverty among agriculturists, and businessmen. So like this, you can at least have at least some 4 or 5 objectives. Limit your objectives as much as possible and study that. Okay. Then the next thing is you should also develop the hypothesis. So next thing is the hypothesis is a statement, the validity of which needs to be tested. So you should have a hypothesis that I already explained to you that. Then this is also important, research questions. You must also kind of at least have certain, apart from objectives, you must have research questions. Maybe that in a research questions in a poverty study that we are talking about. So to understand the income level of what is the income level of the individuals, that's one of the kind of research questions you try to answer. And the second maybe question is to understand whether that whether the kind of occupation really matters when it comes to poverty, but whether that a certain section of society has more poverty than others. So this is also certain research. Any research question must be looking at the object based on the objectives. I'll give you some examples of research questions later. Then once you also have some research questions, some 10 research questions based on your objective, you must have operational definition of the concept. That means you would have used a lot of technical terms in the study. Whatever technical terms that you use in study must be defined very clearly. You should explain what is poverty. You should explain what is a GDP, what's an income. You should also what do you mean by lower income, higher income. You must also kind of define what you mean by rural, at least Bangalore. What should be the kind of place population or whatever, based on some criteria you must kind of define. So all the technical terms that are used in your kind of research must be, you give small definitions, operationalize it. That is, what does it mean in your study must be very clearly. When you say a poor man, you must very clearly state who is a poor man in your study. So operational definition is all the technical terms you're going to define. Then you also have to define the geographical area for the study to be covered. So that's already defined in the scope itself. And the reference period. That means whether your study is for a period of 5 years between this and this. So that there is maybe that reference in point. This study is to understand the poverty level of individuals between this period and this period, maybe between 2015 and 2020, whatever. That how the poverty at least issues are addressed in the study needs to be kind of stated very, very clearly. Then the next one is the next thing that you need to understand is the methodology of the study. The methodology. So what is the methodology that you're going to use must be stated. See, there are different methods of research. I already explained to you, whether yours is an exploratory study or a descriptive study or analytical study. So the method that you use must be very clearly stated. And the methodology, you must say that what kind of tools that you're going to use, whether you're going to use a questionnaire or whether you're going to use an interview schedule or you're going to use an observation schedule, that must be very clearly stated. And the sampling method that you're going to use must be stated. And how are you going to collect the data? So sampling and tools and reference period. And you should also state the reference period and how are you going to plan the analysis, whether the data is going to be analyzed using some ANOVA or chi-square or factor analysis. What statistical tools that you use must be stated on the head plan of analysis. Then you must also state how your report is going to be structured, in how many chapters you will be completing your additional report must be stated. Then the time schedule, that is, what is the time that you require in order to complete this project. In the first 6 months, what are you going to do? You're going to do a survey literature. And second 6 months, you're going to prepare maybe some tools for the collection of data. Next 6 months, you will collect the data. Another 6 months, you will analyze and prepare the draft. And the last 6 months, you're going to finalize the report. Whatever time schedule must be stated here. And also, the financial budget must also be stated. What does it require to do that? So I just want to give certain examples of the statement of problem. For instance, you talk about, see here, in one of these studies, the South Indian Bank, which is a banking company, and ICICI Prudential, which is an insurance company. South Indian Bank does banking business, whereas ICICI Prudential does insurance business. Both these organizations wanted to kind of merge so that they can take advantage of both their business, and so that those who come for banking can be offered insurance policies. Those who come for insurance policies can be promoted to become bank customers. This was the whole idea of this whole project. And so in this at least study, this is how we're going to state the problem. It said that, the scope of banking activities and services that are being provided. First, it starts with a little introduction. It says the banking activities are growing and even insurance business is growing. And in the statement problem saying there is a need for bringing these two businesses together in order to get cross benefits for this particular at least venture. So bank assurance offering insurance products along with banking services. That means they want to merge both, and they want to do one institutional business, both offering a banking products and also the insurance product. So this MOU places mutual right and obligations, currently providing mutual benefits. Will it? So the problem is they want to understand whether such a merger of both these companies will bring in some kind of cross benefits both to the South Indian Bank and also the ICICI Bank. That means to understand what will be the benefits to both the companies, what will be the limitations to both the companies, is what is the crux of the problem in this study. That's the statement of the problem. Next thing is, when we are talking about objectives for this particular study, please mind you, the objectives must always kind of, you should have 5 or 6 objectives with the study. You should also say, it should always kind of start like this: to study, to analyze, to ascertain, understand. An objective should always have a prefix like this: to study, to analyze, ascertain, and so on. So, so they again says the literature. So wait 1 second. Literature review. I'll come back later. We'll go to the object explanation is. Yeah. So this is, please mind you, any objective, if you want to kind of phrase for this particular, maybe that study you want to at least, have the objectives, please mind you, while framing the objectives, you should keep in mind these things. Any objective that your frame must be specific. It should be very specific, it should not be very vague. And it should be measurable, whereby the outcome must be, you should be able to measure the outcome. And it must be very acceptable in the sense it must be make some meaning to all the kind of stakeholders and so on. And it must be very realistic. An objective stating that now we're going to have a sample size of maybe 1,000 and so on, which is not kind of beyond your thing. So it must be kind of realistic, and it must be time related. So that means you must say that you're going to achieve this objective in a certain period of time. And it must be very inspiring. And this objective must identify the main variables of the study. That means it should cover, for instance, in a poverty study, it must cover maybe all the essentials, elements related to poverty, such as income, education qualifications, and maybe the gender. It must cover any other kind of variables, maybe developmental issues, maybe that, we talk about, the education, all these variables. So identify all the main variables and identify the direction. That means whether it's going to give a proper direction, it's going to be a rural poverty we're talking about, or urban poverty we're talking about. Identify the direction also. And please mind you, these objectives must be very ethical. It should not be unethical. Should be novel. That means it must be very modern, actually in character. An outdated objective if you have, it doesn't serve any purpose. It must be logical and it must be observable. So what are the objectives for the study that we have taken up? We told about the ICICI Prudential and South Indian Bank. See, the first objective is to ascertain if bank assurance. See, when a banking company sells insurance products, it's called as bank assurance. I repeat, when a banking company sells insurance products also, it's called as bank assurance. So to ascertain if this bank assurance, that means the banking company is selling insurance, has will help South Indian Bank to increase its customer base and customer satisfaction. That's the first objective. Second objective, to find out the bank assurance has been profitable to South Indian Bank. Find out whether selling these insurance policies by the bank is profitable to the South Indian Bank. The third objective is to analyze the cross benefits of bank assurance, that is, the selling insurance policies by the bank is beneficial to both South Indian Bank and also to the ICICI Prudential. So like this, you can have some 6 or 7 whatever objectives in a study. And then you must also kind of develop a hypothesis. So how do you develop a hypothesis? See, a hypothesis, a tentative assumption, the validity of which needs to be tested later on. See, in any hypothesis, higher the sales, greater is the operating profit. This is one of the hypotheses in a business-related study. Higher the sales, if sales are more, the profits are more. Operating profits are more. That's why it needs to be tested whether that sales has any relation to profits. Will have to be tested only through the data, and you may accept it or reject it later. Another hypothesis, there is no relationship between sales and profits. That means this is a null hypothesis. There is no relationship, that negatively speaking, because one of them will have to be accepted later on. That's why you develop a null hypothesis and also an alternate hypothesis. Another illustration hypothesis, in a study on working capital management to maximize profit in a construction company. This is the hypothesis. It says there is no relationship between efficient working capital management and profitability in construction company. And null hypothesis, there is alternate hypothesis, there is a relationship between efficient working capital management and profitability in construction company. Like this, you try to have some kind of a hypothesis. So, well, that you have at least that, and how do you kind of look at the scope? How do you put the scope? This is an example of scope of study. Scope study covers 2 things. One is geographical coverage and the functional coverage. In a geographical coverage, you want to say this study is confined to Bangalore city, or whether whole of Karnataka, the whole of India, and so on. But in functional coverage, you're going to say what are the kind of variables that you're going to cover in the study, or the functional or functions of this particular problem that you're going to cover. Maybe say in a functional coverage, under the scope study, you have to say what are the variables that are going to be covered. Let's say for retail business. See, when you're talking about variable, there is independent variables, dependent variables, and moderating variables. The independent variables for retail business is maybe a store location. This is a very independent variable. With an independent variables, this will affect others, but this is not going to get affected. Store location, weather, age, occupation, family status, all these are independent variables in a retail business variables. A dependent variable is sales depends on actually sales, customer needs, and profits will depend on all these factors, weather, occupation, all this. So because all these independent factors affect the sales, affect the customer needs, and also affect the profits. So in a scope of study, you must include all these variables. You should say the scope study covers all these variables, independent variables such as weather, age, so on, and also independent or dependent variables such as customer sales, profits, and so on. A moderating variable is which is going to kind of a gender, which will not directly affect, but indirectly affect both of them, both independent and dependent variable. Gender will affect both of them because, for instance, when you're talking about kind of customer, a male customer's habits may be different from a female customer's habits. So that's why they are called as mediating variables. So in any scope of study, you must define one is the geography, that's a geographical coverage of study, and also the variables you're going to cover in the study. So the next one is operational definition. So this is an example of operational definition of concepts. So in a definition of anxiety, like for instance, you are doing a study on maybe that it describes something in terms of operational procedures. So because let us say you're doing a study on anxiety, but maybe in a psychological study, but you have to define what you mean by anxiety with relation to whether there are different types of anxiety symptoms. One is maybe a withdrawal symptom, or it could be kind of very patient becoming violent, or maybe that it becoming very sympathetic and so on. So here you have to say what you mean by anxiety, whether you're talking anxiety in terms of the withdrawal symptom, or in terms of the violent behavior, or maybe a sympathetic behavior. So because in a study when you say just anxiety and give a general definition, it does not work like that. So you must say, according to you, how have you used this term anxiety in your study must be very clearly stated. Then examples of methodology, that in a methodology of a study, there are different types of that you should state. What is the type of study? What are the sources of data that you want to collect? And what is the process of data collection? And what are the tools of data collection? And how you're going to analyze the data? The types of study, you must also say whether your study is descriptive. All this you must say with examples. Then, and the data that you're going to collect must also be stated. Whether you're going to collect a primary data or a secondary data. See, a primary data is a data that you're going to collect using a questionnaire or an interview schedule. So you will collect that personally, collected by the researcher personally from the respondents or the sample units for the purpose of study. Primary data is when you are collecting the data right from the respondent, and then it becomes a primary data. But a secondary data is a published data, which you can gather from books, records, and so on, journals, and so on, public records, historical, statistical documents, business documents, technical trade journals, diaries, unpublished bibliography. These are the sources of secondary data. So in your research design, you're going to state whether you're going to collect the primary data or you're going to collect secondary data must be very clearly stated in the research design. Then as far as the sampling plan is concerned, the example of sampling plan is that you have to state under this head whether that you're going to at least what is the universe of the study. That means the whole universe of study. Maybe the whole universe is your Bangalore is the whole universe, or the whole of Karnataka is your universe. And then, so then based on that, what are the kind of time constraints, resource constraints and all that, and how you're going to indicate you are not. So please mind you, a sample must be a representative of the universe. So here you're going to define what is your sampling units, whether your customers or your sampling, who are you going to collect the data from, whether from maybe that, customers, whether you're going to collect the data from maybe the employees, whether you're going to collect the data from officials of the maybe government. What is the sampling unit? A sampling unit is the people from whom you want to collect the data. You must also state the sample size. What is going to be sample size? Where you going to at least, let us say about 1,000 people are in your universe. Are you going to select some 100 people, which is some maybe 10%. So sample size, you must say whether it's a 10% of the universe you're going to select for the purpose of sample. And what is the sampling technique? Whether you're going to use random sampling, or whether you're going to use stratified random, or cluster sampling, or you're going to use the snowball sampling, and whatever that needs to be stated. So your respondents could be companies, managers, or HR managers, officers, whatever. And please mind you, there is always kind of, for any beginning researchers, this is a very confusing question. What should be the ideal sample size? Please mind you, although there are so many other tests which are kind of applied, common sense tells you that, there should be a percentage of universe of population in a study. So it should be generally 5 times the number of questions in a data collection. Generally, if it's a very macro level study, about 1,000 units will be ideal, and maybe that 2,000 units may be a very good sample size for thing. But generally, there's no kind of specification on the number of a sample. It depends on the level of study that you are. For instance, it's a very article you want to publish. You may not have some 1,000 samples and so on. You may take some 100 or 200 samples and then finish with the data. But if your study magnitude is very bigger, then you have to go for a very larger sampling. These are the methods of sampling where you use a random. Random is not merely just interviewing anybody and everybody that you meet. It's also because in a random sample also every unit of population must have equal chance of being selected. So you must use either random or cluster or stratified or it can be a multi-stage sampling. At least, maybe first you classify them into different stages, and from each stage you'll pick up certain samples at random. Or it can be judgmental. Sometimes, when the population is not very well defined, you use your judgment in order to kind of, there is some pockets where you will be, the sample would be very strong. So you using your judgment, you will try to kind of collect the data from such people. Maybe there are some experts who can give you more realistic picture of a certain phenomenon. You will use your judgment, and you will not use any random method there. Or it can be convenience. When the data is very disorganized, not very well organized, then you also use the convenience sampling. In a snowball sampling, what you do is you will try to meet the first one when the data is not very structured. When the respondents are not very structured, you will go to the first one. From that person, you will take the reference and go to second one. And from second one, you take the reference and go to third, fourth, and so on. So that's what is called as snowball sampling. That also you may use. And tools and techniques for collection of data. So how you're going to use the tools and techniques for the collection of data is you either use a questionnaire to collect the data, then you use an interview schedule. The difference between questionnaire and the interview schedule is both are a list of questions, but when the respondent fills the instrument, it's called as a questionnaire. When you are collecting, you are asking questions and filling the information, becomes an interview schedule. Or you can also resort to telephonic interviews, or you may use some Google Forms by using UMAE methods or some other forms, or maybe that you will collect the data through observation. This happens in the case of psychological studies. You observe certain phenomena and collect the data. And also focus groups, that you'll conduct some focus group interviews with certain experts, and you will call them for a group discussion and then try to get the data from them. And the next step in the research design is that you have to define your plan of analysis. You want to here say how will you compile the data, how will you classify the data, how will you tabulate the data. Then also you have to interpret and infer certain suggestions. Then you look at the analysis of the data. So having at least, you should also here you have to state how you're going to analyze the data, and you should use at least, while analyzing the data, you must at least tabulate the data. And if there are 20, say that there are 50 questions in a questionnaire, these questions must be tabulated. You must prepare certain tables in a report writing. In the at least chapterization, I'm going to say how the chapterization is done. There you have to kind of analyze the data by table explanation, and table explanation. That's the way you're going to do the analysis of the data. So each question is reduced to a table, followed by analysis and interpretation. It should also be supported by graphs and charts. So this is the way you're going to analyze the data. This is one of the studies conducted for some different consumer response to maybe different types of chocolates, that these are the parameters, these are the kind of data, and maybe you'll have some graph like this. You're going to analyze the data by explaining what that maybe 68% respondents consider distribution the main thing, and other 80%. So this is the way you want to explain. You'll also draw some inference. It can be safely assumed that distribution and supply are given due emphasis. That's a thing. And again, you'll also have to give the summary of findings, conclusions, and recommendation. And then a brief conclusion on suggestions to be very, very practical. So then you have to give the bibliography. So at this point of time, what I would like to kind of know, of course, this is the binding specification that your reports need to be hardbound, and it should be kind of maybe that serial numbered, and you should use some times Roman 12 in order to kind of print the thesis. So actually, let me tell you in a very common or simple layman's language as to how to prepare a thesis report actually having correct way. To go back again, I told you that first, if you go back, let me kind of brief up so that your things are very clear. It got mixed up maybe. In any study, please mind you, see, in any study, that any thesis writing for a PhD or MPhil or anything for that matter, generally a research report is divided into certain chapters. Generally, it is presented in 5 chapters. In the first chapter, what probably you will do is, in the first chapter, you will give the introduction. In the first chapter, please mind you, you will give the introduction to the study. So you will give the first chapter, please mind you, is devoted to introduction. In the introduction, what you kind of need is that you are developing a theoretical framework for the study. Let us understand that now you're going to make a study on maybe that when we are talking about the poverty issue, maybe a study on poverty itself. First chapter you're going to give is little about the poverty, meaning of poverty, and maybe different, maybe the importance of studying, poverty levels and distribution of poverty levels, poverty level in India, poverty issues across the globe, all this little introduction, maybe for a PhD thesis about, let us say about some 50 pages of little introduction on how different facets of poverty and theoretical framework of poverty must be put in the first chapter. For this, of course, you can refer to a lot of books, journals, and so on. And then maybe about 50 pages of maybe that chapter you're going to have with a little introduction to poverty, other issues. Please mind you, while preparing this chapter, although you're taking from different books and so on, you must cite the reference. What is most important is at the foot of the page, wherever you use somebody's, at least the references, you must cite the reference. And the method of citation, I'm going to probably tell you a little later. Please mind you, in the first chapter, you're going to, at least of the 5 chapters in a thesis, first chapter is devoted to introduction. And please mind you, in the second chapter, you must also give the literature review. You must give the literature review. That means, you must at least, make about some 100 studies you must refer to based on related to your own topic and quote those 100 studies. I will tell you that how to kind of, maybe provide the literature review. 1 second. So you must quote at least about 100 studies, and in the second chapter, all the literature review, about 100 studies you will prepare, that comes to approximately, let us say, about 100 pages of review of literature, quoting at least about, maybe that half a page is enough to quote a particular study. In about 50 pages, you're going to complete the survey of literature, stating the author's name, the title of the study, and what are the brief findings of this study must be stated. So about 100 such studies you're going to prepare in the second chapter. This also that you can refer to the literature and prepare. Please mind, in the third chapter, you're going to have the research design. The third chapter, you must have the research design. And the what you should have in the research design, all these are the elements in the third chapter you're going to cover. Lead to introduction, problem, purpose, scope of study, objectives, thesis, hypothesis, research questions, operational definition, and methodology. All these you're going to cover in the third chapter in the research design. In the research design chapter, you're going to cover about all this. You're going to write about half a paragraph about all these issues, about little problem, about your objectives, about your hypothesis, about your research questions. All this you're going to write at least very briefly about half a page, every element of it. So that forms your third chapter. Please mind you, in the fourth chapter, you're going to analyze the data that you collected. In the fourth chapter is the core chapter, where you're going to analyze all the data. For data that you collected by using the questionnaire or interview schedule needs to be analyzed in this fourth chapter. And please mind you, in the last chapter, you're going to summarize all the findings of the study in bulleted forms, and that you're going to kind of provide some suggestions, conclusions, and so on. So this is how you have to have all these 5 chapters for any thesis or any report, infant dissertation or PhD thesis, or even for some kind of thing. But for articles, it's different. The kind of procedure is different for writing an article. So here I'm talking about the thesis for that matter. So all this is how your chapterization is done. And at the end of the chapter, after these 5 chapters, you should also give the bibliography. So bibliography is given like this. So for books, I say you have to citation books. For a book, details required are in order. You must give first the author's name, year. This is the bibliography you're going to give at the end of your at least 5 chapters. You should also provide the list of books you referred, journals you referred, websites you referred, and so on. So for a book, details required are you have to give the author, year, title, and so on. This is the way you're going to go say that now first the author's name, then the year of publication, and the title of the paper, and also the publisher's name, and also the place of publication. This is the way actually you have to kind of give the at least bibliography. If there are 2 or more authors, you state the author's name, the title, and again the place of publication and the publisher's name. If it's a journal, this is the way the referencing is done. Process, Hopkins, and use as a food ingredient, whatever, that then again. So if it's a conference paper, this is the way it is kind of cited. What I'll do is, there's not much time at least available. I'll leave this kind of, maybe that presentation with the maybe organizers, you can kind of have a look at it at your own free time. Then citation referencing of a newspaper, this is the way you cite the reference. Referencing from a textbook, you're going to show, this is the way at least you will show the referencing. And if it's a journal article, see there are certain common observations that you use in research. This should also kind of, you should, in the footnote, you must say this. For instance, anon, this, the anonymous, that means, the reference is not known. From where that, who is the author and so on is not known. So you use the term anonymous. Ante means before. CA or C means around a given date. CF means confer. CH means chapter or chapters. ED means edition, edited by or editors. Et al means and others. That means we'll use, too many authors. You'll quote 1 or 2 authors and say all others. Et al. You say et al. Et seque and the following. Ibid means in the same place. Following page or pages. So these abbreviations you are use it in the footnote. In order, instead of saying in the following pages, you'll use this term J or FF. For instance, I or double I is kind of line or lines. Loc or sit, loco citation in the place cited. Manuscript or manuscripts. So this no place publication. PP means pages and so on. So like this, there are so many observations that you're going to kind of use. So I have just given you that in the first session that my purpose was to kind of to recap again that I have given you the process of research. To recap again, the process of research, as I told you, is to so the process of research is, the first thing is you will try to identify the problem, and selection and identification of problem. Then you will review the literature. Then you will understand the problem. Then formulate the problem, collect the data using some samples, analyze the data, then test your hypothesis, and also write the report. And writing the report, your report is going to be divided into 5 chapters. The first chapter you will give an introduction. In the second chapter, you will give the literature review. And in the third chapter, you will give the design of the study, which so many other, I told you this is the components of research design, about everything, half a page you're going to write. In the fourth chapter, you will analyze the data, where you would have collected a lot of data you are analyzing. In the last chapter, you're going to provide the summary of findings and conclusions, and later you will give the bibliography. So this is the whole thing about the process of research and how you go about doing. Maybe in the at least the next session, we'll be handling 2 things. One is what is the at least method for selecting a problem, and what at least considerations we should have in selecting a problem, and also how to do the literature review, and what there are some examples of how literature review is done and how you're going to put that in the report. This is what I'm planning to kind of speak in the next session. If you have any questions in the for the first session, you may please go ahead. In another 5 minutes, we can discuss on some questions, and then in the second, you can take a break for about 15 minutes. I think at 11:45 we're going to have the second session. Yeah. If you have any questions, you're most welcome.
Thank you, sir. I think I will take the questions from the chat box. There is only one question right now, which I will read out.
Yeah.
So Fatima ma'am is asking, what are the differences among action words we can use in objectives?
What is the
What are the different action
action
words
words? I'll
we
show you
can
one second.
to find out?
It's good
Yeah.
that you asked me one second.
So I think I'll rephrase that question. Madam is
I
asking.
got it.
Yeah. Okay.
See this word. Actually, the action word that we generally use in objective is like this: to study, to analyze, to ascertain, to understand, to probe, to observe. These are the. It's only kind of a small list that I put, but we must always use the at least prefix to denote that we are going to. This is the end point with which we are doing the study. We say that to study the factors causing at least poverty, to analyze the different levels of at least poverty among different occupations, to ascertain, to understand, to probe. These are the action, at least the words that we use in the case of objectives.
Okay, I think there is. If you could tell us, like, if we are to take to analyze and to ascertain, how different does that become?
Analyze and ascertain.
Yes,
No,
just
no.
for example, yeah.
For instance, when you say analyze, that we are trying to kind of analyze the causes of certain kind of to analyze the causes of poverty for that matter. Let us say that we are trying to analyze by at least with the different kind of variables. One is, see, when you say ascertain is actually it can be that whether yes or no. In analysis, there are different options that could come up. But when you say ascertain, whether it is yes or no. When you have to positively work towards some objective, or maybe that negatively, we generally use this term ascertain, which is a kind of there is no kind of variation there as far as the results are concerned. But in analyze, it can, as a result of analysis, any at least outcome may come up.
Fatima ma'am, I hope that is answered. The next question is what to mention in end notes and footnotes.
Yeah, in the case of footnotes, generally what we do is that you're talking about citations, or you're talking about the citation, yeah.
End notes and footnotes.
Yeah, that footnotes we generally use it for citations actually.
Okay.
That we're going to, if you are taking any text from a particular author or anywhere, in our at least preliminary chapters which is already a published one, we have to at least acknowledge the source by citing the author's name and other particulars in the foot of the page.
So does that go in the bibliography as well, or is it only to be
Bibliography is
covered in
different.
one place?
The difference between citation and bibliography is, citation is that a particular article is referred, you're quoting the author. In a bibliography, all the books that you have studied without any reference to a particular article or any particular section of a book, generally referred. That you're putting in a bibliography. That's the difference between bibliography and citation.
The next question is from Mr. Sahid Anwar.
Yeah.
Is it necessary to write research questions in synopsis?
It will be good actually. If you write the research questions, so that it gives you a direction as to how to proceed. It will be good to write a research question, definitely.
Okay, sir. Next is from Mr. Shashidhar. I think his question you answered. So how to find dependent and independent variable?
That I already kind of know.
This will be taken in another session in details.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, actually, I'll go back to the dependent variable. It's here only. I'll just show it to him better. It's here. In the scope of the study, the dependent variable is one which is going to affect the other variable. So please mind you, independent variable is one which is going to affect the other variables. For instance, when you talk about kind of education, it's an independent variable which will affect in turn the income or other things. So that becomes a kind of dependent variable. Please mind you, in the case of independent variable, it does not vary. it remains constant, whereas a dependent variable is, it's going to be affected by an independent variable. But let us say that we are talking about, the sales, profit, all these are dependent variables, whereas income, maybe the family size, all these are independent variables. So a family size will affect the sales. If the larger the family, it will buy more, so the sales is going to be more. So the profits are going to be more. So sales and profit are dependent variables, whereas a family size is an independent variable.
I think that is very lucidly explained. I hope that answers the question. There is another question on sample size. We have a dedicated session on that, so I will not take it up right now. There is another question on what is the difference between reference, bibliography, and citations.
Reference?
Bibliography.
I just now I explained that actually, that bibliography is a general reading that you have done, which encompasses all the books you have referred, all the websites you have referred, all the journals you have referred. Citation is when you take from a particular article, it becomes citation.
Okay. And
bibliography references are one and the same. Anyway.
Okay. The next question is, sir, can objectives and research questions be together?
Objectives and research questions, no. What happens? From problem you come to the objectives. From objectives you come to the research questions. It's a split from the objectives actually. An objective is again split into certain research questions. It's only an offshoot of the objective. For instance, let us say the objective is to find out the causes for increase in sales. That's the objective. The questions are whether the sales over a period of time has increased, whether that the promotion. But sorry, 1 second, I put off the fan. I'm sorry.
No problem, sir.
So, I was telling you what I was saying. I'm sorry.
Objectives.
It is actually from the research gap, you're going to get the statement of the problem. Because when you review the literature, you will find some gaps. From research gap, you're going to have the statement of problem. From statement of problem, that now you will arrive at the objectives. The objectives are again split into research questions. Research questions are split into variables. This is how it is. An objective, I told you, let us say, objective is to find out the causes for increase in sales. The research questions are again whether the sales has increased over a period of time. Second thing is whether to understand whether the promotion budget for marketing has gone up or at least remains the same. And the third thing is whether at least the buying habits of the people have changed. So these are all the research questions, whereas increase in sales is to find out the causes for increase in sales is an objective.
Thank you, sir. Another question we have is action verb used in the objective pertinent to a specific statistical tool?
No, actually that we don't have to. What happens in the plan of analysis, you must kind of state what statistical tools that you're going to kind of use, not in the objective. In the objective, you're going to state what endpoint that you're going to arrive at with reference to a particular issue concerning the problem. Generally, the statistical tool reference is made in the plan of analysis. There you're going to state what statistical tools you're going to use in order to analyze a particular objective.
Sir, I think ma'am is trying to ask whether the verb that we use, does it have any relevance on the statistical tool to be applied?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. When you say trying to ascertain means any tool that you can always use. Absolutely. You're going to say that you know to study the impact. To study the impact, of course, that there are certain various tools are available, not one tool. So not necessarily.
Okay. So there are a couple of questions which we have already covered, and some have been. So I think we will be passing the YouTube link, and participants can go through them because the questions are repetitive in nature. And like somebody has asked, how to write research proposal? Sir just took that in great details. Also, what is the research gap was taken yesterday.
Yeah.
There's again one participant asking about what is to be included in chapter 1 and all. I think you again told that in the session today. Yeah. So participants, please note, we will be sharing the YouTube link and you can go through the same session again. And maybe after that also, if you have queries, you can mail it back to us and we will come back to you with an answer. Yeah, I think we can take a call for a break right now and meet at 11:45 then. Meanwhile, if participants have questions, you can post it in the chat box and we will take it when we get back after the break.
Sure.
Okay, then for break
Thank you.
now.
We'll come back.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can, yeah.